My name is Renata Voss, and I was 31 years old when my father's new wife looked me in the eye at a family dinner and told me, with a smile that never quite reached her eyes, that my name had been removed from the house I grew up in. She didn't say it like a threat. She said it the way you'd mention a change in the cable plan. Your father and I are simplifying things. You understand. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I set down my fork, folded my napkin, and drove home to my apartment in Columbus with the windows down and the radio off. What Diane didn't know, what none of them knew, because my grandfather had been a quiet, deliberate man who believed in doing things properly the first time, was that there was a document filed in the county recorder's office in 2009 that no one had thought to look for. A deed. My name on it, in ink, witnessed and notarized, recorded and indexed. It had been there for 14 years. It was still there. By the time anyone thought to check, it was too late to pretend otherwise. Welcome back to channel, where quiet people let the paperwork do the talking. If you're new here, hit subscribe. New stories drop every week. And if this one sounds familiar, leave a comment. You might not be as alone as you think. My grandfather, Renata Voss, came to Ohio from western Pennsylvania in 1971 with a Ford pickup, a toolbox, and enough saved to put a deposit on 42 acres outside of Marysville. He wasn't a sentimental man in the way people usually mean that. He didn't frame things or make speeches. But he kept records. Carbon copies in manila envelopes. Deeds in a fireproof lockbox. Receipts going back to the Carter administration. When I was small and would sit on the floor of his study while he worked at his desk, he used to say the same thing every time he filed something away. A paper in the right drawer is worth 10 promises at the right table.
I didn't understand it then.
I do now. My father, Daniel Voss, was Werner's only son. He grew up on those 42 acres, moved into town when he married my mother, and when my mother died, I was 9, a car accident on Route 36 in December. Werner was the one who showed up. Not just for the funeral, for the year after. He drove to Columbus every other weekend. He took me to hardware stores and let me push the flat cart. He made soup that I still haven't been able to replicate. He was steady in the way that some people are steady, like a fixed point, like something that doesn't require maintenance because it was built right the first time. My father remarried when I was 24. I want to be fair about this, because fairness matters to the story. He was lonely. My mother had been gone for 15 years. He met Diane Calloway at a church social in Marysville, and she was warm and organized and laughed at his jokes, and I could see what he saw in her. I went to the wedding. I gave a toast. I meant what I said. Diane had 2 children from her first marriage, her son, Garrett, who was 29, and her daughter, Petra, who was 26. They were fine people in the ordinary sense. We were never close, but there was no particular friction in the early years. We saw each other at holidays. We were polite. That was enough. I was working by then as a licensed structural engineer for a mid-sized firm in Columbus. I'd finished my degree at Ohio State, passed my PE exam on the first try, and was 3 years into a job I was genuinely good at. I was not a person who talked about what she had. I drove a 6-year-old Subaru with a cracked dashboard vent. I split a 2-bedroom apartment with a friend named Claire, a nurse who kept odd hours and never left dishes in the sink. I didn't talk about my grandfather's land. I didn't mention the conversation he and I had had when I was 20, when he sat me down in that same study and told me he had done some paperwork and that I should know about it, and that I should remember the name of the drawer. I remembered. Werner died in March of 2017, 2 years after my father married Diane. He was 81, and it was cardiac, and it was fast enough that he didn't suffer, which was exactly what he would have wanted. The funeral was in Marysville, at the Lutheran church he'd attended for 40 years, and the pews were full of people I didn't know but who seemed to know me. Neighbors, former employees, men from his Kiwanis chapter, who had to be in their 90s. He had been a person of consequence in a quiet way, the kind of consequence that doesn't make the news but fills a church. I cried in the parking lot afterward, alone, for about 4 minutes. Then I drove to the reception. His estate went through probate, which took the better part of a year. The 42 acres in Union County were the significant asset. His house sat on the property, a ranch style that he'd built out twice over the decades, solid-framed, well-maintained, the kind of place that could outlast everyone in the room. He had also owned the mineral rights, which weren't worth much in that part of Ohio, but which he had guarded with the same careful attention he gave everything else. What Werner had done in 2009, 8 years before he died, and for reasons he explained to me only in the broadest terms, reasons that had to do with his understanding of my father's habits and his feeling that a certain kind of protection was warranted, was execute a quitclaim deed transferring an undivided interest in the property directly to me. Not to my father.
To me.
Recorded at the Union County Recorder's Office on a Thursday in April. Indexed under my name and his. Witnessed by his attorney and a notary at the same office where he'd filed everything else for 40 years. He told me about it the summer I was 20, when I came to help him paint the back porch. He showed me the copy he kept in the lockbox. He told me the drawer. He didn't make a production of it. "It's your name on the land," he said. "It doesn't do anything until it needs to." Then he handed me a paintbrush, and we finished the porch. I had told no one. Not my father, not Claire, not anyone from work. It wasn't a secret I protected out of strategy. It was more that it was private in the way that certain things are private. My grandfather had trusted me with it quietly, and I kept it quietly. That was, looking back, exactly the right instinct. It started, as these things often do, so gradually that I spent the first year wondering if I was misreading it. The first sign was small, Diane mentioned, at Thanksgiving 2017, 8 months after Werner's death, that she and my father had been getting their documents in order. She said it conversationally, the way you'd mention a dentist appointment. She was passing the gravy at the time. My father nodded. I asked, mildly, what that meant. "Just estate planning," she said. "Making sure everything's organized. You know how it gets." I didn't know how it got. I was an engineer. I understood systems and documentation. But I let it go. In the spring of 2018, I stopped receiving mail at my father's address. I hadn't used it as a mailing address in years, but I'd kept it on file with a few institutions out of habit. When I noticed and mentioned it to my father, he said Diane had done an address change request to streamline things, that she thought I'd appreciate not having old mail piling up at their house. His voice had that particular quality it sometimes got when he was relaying something he hadn't entirely agreed to. I thanked him. I updated my addresses myself. In the fall of 2018, I went to renew my membership at a sportsman's club in Marysville that Werner had belonged to for decades and that I had joined at his invitation years earlier. The woman at the desk told me my membership had lapsed, that there had been a request to remove my name from the family membership the previous spring. She was apologetic. She offered to reinstate me. I told her I'd think about it and went home. I called my father that evening. He picked up on the third ring and sounded like he'd been half asleep. I told him what I'd found out. There was a pause. Then, "Renata, you know how Diane is about keeping things tidy. She probably thought you weren't using it. I'll talk to her." I told him it was fine, that I'd handle my own membership. He said okay. He didn't call back. I started keeping a folder. Not out of anger.
I want to be clear about that.
I kept the folder the way my grandfather would have kept the folder, because a paper in the right drawer is worth 10 promises at the right table. I wrote down the date of the address change request, the membership removal, the vague Thanksgiving comment. I made notes in my own handwriting, time-stamped, in a small spiral notebook I kept in my desk at work. In early 2019, Diane called me directly. This was unusual. In 4 years of her being my father's wife, she had called me maybe 6 times. She was pleasant. She asked how my work was going, whether I was still in the same apartment, whether I'd thought about buying instead of renting. All questions that felt like orientation, like someone taking a reading. Then she said, "Your father and I are thinking about the Marysville property. We want to make sure everything's in one name for simplicity. I'm sure you understand how much easier that makes things." I told her I understood the concept. She said, "Great. There may be some paperwork for you to sign at some point, just title clearing stuff. Nothing significant." I said I'd look at anything they sent me. She said, "Wonderful." She sounded genuinely warm when she said it. I did not sign anything. Nothing arrived in the mail. I assumed, for a while, that the idea had been shelved. I was wrong. In the fall of 2020, my father had a health scare, a cardiac event, Moderate, caught early enough that he was out of the hospital in 4 days and home with medication adjustments and a set of lifestyle instructions that he followed for about 6 weeks before reverting. I drove to Marysville 3 times during that stretch. Diane was present every time, efficient and capable and clearly in charge of the household in a way that my father seemed to find comfortable. I don't say that with judgment. She kept things running. That was real. But during my third visit, while my father was resting, I sat in the kitchen with Diane, and she brought up the property again. Her voice was quieter now, more certain. "Your father is going to want things settled," she said. "It's not fair to leave things ambiguous. It makes things harder for everyone, and frankly, it would make his recovery less stressful if we could close this out." I asked what specifically she meant by closing it out. She said, "Just consolidating the deed into his name alone. It's how it should have been all along." She looked at me steadily when she said it. "Your grandfather meant well, but he set things up in a way that's frankly more complicated than it needs to be." I looked at her. I said, "I'd want to review anything before signing." She said, "Of course. We'll have the attorneys send something over." Nothing came. A year passed. I stopped expecting it. In January 2022, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was a paralegal at a firm in Marysville I hadn't heard of, a woman named Keisha, pleasant and professional, calling to let me know that the Voss property in Union County was scheduled for a title transfer and that there was a document requiring my acknowledgement. Asked her to send it to me. She said she'd follow up by email. The email arrived 2 days later. It was a quitclaim deed, my name on the grantor line, my father's name on the grantee line, the Union County property description in the legal section. Attached was a cover letter from an attorney named Gerald Mintz explaining that this was a straightforward consolidation of title and that my signature before a notary would complete the process. I read it 3 times. Then I called the Union County Recorder's office. The woman who answered was efficient and matter-of-fact. I gave her my name and the parcel number. She looked it up. She confirmed that a deed had been recorded on April 17, 2009. Naming me and Werner Voss as joint owners with right of survivorship. She confirmed it had never been vacated, amended, or superseded. She spelled my name back to me twice to make sure. I thanked her and sat with that for a long moment. Then I called Gerald Mintz's office and left a message saying I had reviewed the document and had some questions, and that I would need to discuss the title history before proceeding. He called back 2 days later and was pleasant and slightly careful in the way attorneys get when something has shifted. He said he'd look into it. I told him to take his time. 3 months passed. No follow-up from Mintz. No call from my father. No call from Diane. Then, in April 2022, Diane called again. Her voice was different this time, measured in the way that someone's voice gets when they have decided something and are managing the conversation accordingly. She said, "Renata, your father and I have found a buyer for the Marysville property. It's a fair offer. We're moving closer to Petra now that she has the baby, and it makes sense to liquidate. We'd like to move forward with the closing."
A pause.
"We'd like you to sign the quitclaim before the end of the month." I asked who the buyer was. She gave me a name, a land development company based in Dublin. She told me the sale price, $410,000, which was reasonable for 42 acres in Union County, with a structurally sound house on it. I said, "Diane, I'm not going to sign a quitclaim until I speak with my own attorney." She said, "Renata." And the way she said my name, flat and deliberate, had a quality I hadn't heard from her before. "Your grandfather made a decision that wasn't really his to make. Your father is the one who has maintained this property for 20 years. He is the one who has paid the taxes and kept up the insurance. You have lived in Columbus and had nothing to do with it. Signing this paper is the right thing to do. It's what your grandfather would have wanted if he'd thought it through." I said, "I'll have my attorney contact you." She said, "Your father is going to be very hurt by this." I said, "I hope not." And I meant it. I retained an attorney in Columbus, a property specialist named Sylvia Chen, the following week. She reviewed the 2009 deed, the title history, the quitclaim I'd been asked to sign, and the sale contract. She called me on a Thursday afternoon, and she was very calm and very precise. She said the 2009 deed was unambiguous. She said I was a co-owner of record with a right of survivorship interest that had transferred fully to me upon Werner's death in 2017. She said I could not be compelled to sign a quitclaim. And she said that any title search conducted by a competent title company would surface the 2009 recording immediately. I said, "What happens if they try to proceed without my signature?" She said, "The title officer at closing will find your name on the abstract. The transaction cannot close." She paused. "This is not a close case, Renata." I thanked her, and we arranged that she would communicate with Gerald Mintz's office directly. I went back to work. I told no one. The closing was scheduled for a Thursday in June. Sylvia had advised me that I was entitled to attend the closing as a co-owner of record, and that she would notify all parties of my interest in the title prior to the meeting. She did this by letter, certified, to Gerald Mintz and to the title company handling the transaction, a firm called Consolidated Title Services with an office in Marysville. I drove to Marysville on a Wednesday evening and stayed in a hotel on Route 33. I had dinner alone at a diner I'd been going to since I was a child, a place called Rudy's with orange vinyl booths and a laminated menu that hadn't changed in 20 years. I had the patty melt and a cup of coffee and sat there for a long time looking at the parking lot. I thought about my grandfather sitting at his desk, filing carbon copies in manila envelopes. I thought about the drawer he'd shown me. I thought about him handing me that paintbrush on the back porch and saying, with no ceremony at all, "It's your name on the land." I paid my bill and went back to the hotel and slept soundly, which surprised me. The closing was scheduled for 10 in the morning at the Consolidated Title Services office, a low beige building on Plum Street that I'd driven past 100 times without ever going inside. The lobby had the specific temperature and lighting of all title company offices, climate-controlled and slightly fluorescent, with a conference table visible through a glass partition and a reception desk staffed by a woman who offered me water with practiced calm. I arrived at 9:50. Sylvia had called ahead. The title officer, a woman named Margaret Hollis, who I would learn had been with Consolidated for 19 years, was already in the conference room with a file open. She was compact and gray-haired and had the unhurried, careful quality of someone who had seen a great many things at a closing table and was not surprised by much. She looked up when I walked in and said, "Ms. Voss? I've reviewed your attorney's correspondence." She said it quietly, professionally, with no particular inflection. I said, "Thank you for having me." Garrett was already seated at the table, which surprised me slightly. I'd expected my father and Diane, not her son. He was wearing a blazer and had a folder in front of him, and he looked at me the way you look at something unexpected in a place it shouldn't be. He did not say hello. My father and Diane arrived at 3 minutes past 10. My father was in his church clothes, khakis, a button-down, the gray wool blazer he wore to anything he considered a formal occasion. He looked older than I remembered from Christmas. When he saw me, he stopped walking. Diane was a step behind him. She was in a dark blazer of her own, her hair done, her expression composed. She saw me and her expression stayed composed, that quality of composition that takes practice.
She said, "Renata."
"We didn't know you were coming." I said, "I let Gerald know I'd be here." She said, "Gerald didn't mention it."
I said, "That's okay."
Gerald Mintz arrived 2 minutes later. He was a trim man in his 60s with reading glasses on a chain and the slightly weary efficiency of a small-town attorney who has handled more estate work than he ever intended to. He looked at me, then at Margaret Hollis, then back at me, and he sat down without saying anything about the arrangement. The representative from the buying company, a younger man named Todd who seemed uncertain about why the energy in the room had changed, sat at the far end of the table and looked at his phone. Margaret Hollis waited until everyone was seated. Then she opened the file in front of her and said, with the same unhurried calm she'd greeted me with, "Before we proceed with the documents, I need to walk everyone through the title search results. This is standard, but I want to make sure we're all on the same page before we go further." Diane said, "We've already reviewed everything with Gerald." Margaret said, "I understand. I'd still like to walk through it." She said it pleasantly, with the specific pleasantness of someone who is not asking permission. She turned to the first page of the abstract, and she began to read. I put both hands flat on the table. Something in my chest had gone very still, not anxious, but the way the air before a storm gets still. Quiet and loaded. Margaret read the property description. The original purchase by Renata Voss in 1971. The subsequent improvements and mortgage satisfactions. The transfer following his death in 2017. She read them in the order they appeared in the record, methodical and unhurried. Garrett clicked his pen. My father looked at the table. Diane was watching Margaret with a focused, careful attention. Then Margaret turned to the next page. She read the date first, April 17th, 2009. Then the instrument type, quitclaim deed. Then the grantor, Werner Heinrich Voss. Then she paused for just a fraction of a second, the pause of someone confirming what she already knows is there, and she read the grantee. My name. My full name, first and middle and last. And the interest. Undivided 50% with right of survivorship. She set down her pen. The room did the rest. I have tried, since, to describe what the room felt like in the first 10 seconds after Margaret read my name aloud. The closest I can come is this. It was like being in a building when something structural settles. A shift you feel in the floor before you understand what it is. Garrett's pen stopped clicking. He looked at the document in front of him, and then at Margaret, and then at Diane, and the thing in his face was not quite confusion. It was more like a recalculation being run on incomplete data. My father looked up from the table for the first time since Margaret had started reading. He looked at me with an expression I had not seen on him before and haven't seen since. Not anger. Not embarrassment, but something that might have been the look you have when you realize you've been told a story that wasn't complete. Diane, and this is the part I've thought about most, Diane's composure held for almost a full second after Margaret finished the sentence. And then something behind her eyes shifted, very slightly, the way a room shifts when a window you didn't know was open suddenly swings shut. She looked at the document. She looked at Margaret. She said, and her voice was still controlled. That can't be current. Margaret said, without looking up. It was recorded April 17th, 2009. It's indexed in the Union County records. It's never been vacated, amended, or otherwise modified. She turned the document toward the center of the table, so everyone could see the stamp from the recorder's office. The instrument is valid. Gerald Mintz had taken his reading glasses off and was looking at the table. Todd from the development company had stopped looking at his phone. Diane said, Werner would have discussed something like this with Daniel. She glanced at my father. You didn't know about this. It wasn't quite a question. My father said nothing. Margaret said, I'm not in a position to speak to what was or wasn't discussed. I can speak to the record, and the record shows Ms. Voss as a co-owner of interest. She said it with the same neutral precision she'd brought to everything else. This was not her fight. She was reading a document. The document said what it said. I said nothing. I kept my hands flat on the table. Gerald Mintz picked up his glasses. He said, quietly, to Diane, the right of survivorship would have transferred the interest fully to her when Werner passed in 2017. He said it the way a doctor delivers a result he already knew was coming, not happy about it but not going to pretend it says something different. Legally, she's a co-owner. She'd need to sign anything related to a sale. Diane turned to me. I watched her arrive at a decision about how to proceed. Her voice was careful. She said, Renata, this is a family matter. Your grandfather made this decision without consulting your father. Whatever he intended, I think we can all agree that the right thing. I said, the deed is what it is, Diane. Not loud, not sharp, just the sentence. She looked at me for a moment. Something went very still in her face, not quite anger, but the controlled version of it, the version that waits. My father said, quietly, Rennie, he hadn't called me that since I was 12. Why didn't you say anything? I thought about how to answer that. I thought about the Thanksgiving when Diane was passing the gravy, the address change request, the membership removal, the call about the quitclaim, the conversation in the kitchen when she told me that my grandfather's decision wasn't really his to make. I said, I'm saying something now. Margaret Hollis closed the file with a clean, decisive motion and folded her hands on top of it. She said, Given the title status, I'm not able to proceed with the closing today. The transaction would require either Ms. Voss's co-signature or a court order resolving the ownership question. She looked at Todd, who had gone slightly pale. I'd recommend both parties consult with their attorneys before rescheduling. Todd said, So, we're not closing today. Margaret said, No, we're not. Sylvia had told me, in our preparation call the day before, that if the closing didn't proceed, I would likely hear from my father within 48 hours. She said it matter-of-factly as a logistical prediction, the way she might have predicted that an appeal would take 6 to 8 weeks. She was right. He called that evening. I was in my hotel room eating takeout from a Thai place on Main Street when my phone rang. I looked at his name on the screen for a moment. Then I answered. He said, Renata. Long pause. I don't know what to say. I said, You don't have to say anything tonight. He said, Did you know about the deed? I said, Yes. Another pause. Longer. Then, for how long? I said, Since Grandpa told me. I was 20.
He was quiet for a while.
I ate some of the pad thai and waited. He said, Diane thought she was sure everything was in my name. He sounded tired. She looked into it. She had Gerald look into it. He said there was nothing else. I said, Gerald should have pulled the abstract himself before sending me a quitclaim to sign. My father said, I know.
I said, Dad.
I put down the fork.
I would have talked to you.
I tried to talk to you. Every time I said I wanted to review things before signing, or that I'd have my attorney look at something, you went quiet. You deferred to her. Every time. He didn't answer for a moment. Then I know that too. I said, I don't need you to fix tonight. I just need you to know that I heard every conversation where you let her do the talking. He said, I'm sorry. He meant it. I could hear that he meant it. I said, I know. We didn't talk for much longer that night. But it was a different kind of silence at the end than it had been before. Diane called me the following morning. She was again composed, but it was a different kind of composed. Thinner. She said, I think we should discuss what a reasonable arrangement looks like. I told her I was open to a conversation about options and that my attorney would be in touch. She said, This doesn't have to be adversarial. I said, It never did. Sylvia reached out to Gerald Mintz's office the following week. The situation was legally uncomplicated. I was a co-owner of record with a full interest, and the sale could not proceed without my agreement. What followed over the next 3 months was a negotiation, not acrimonious, but not warm either. My father wanted to sell. He was serious about relocating near Petra and the baby. That part was real, and I didn't want to stand in the way of it. What I wanted was fairness, and what fairness looked like in this case was simple: 50% of the sale proceeds, because that was what the deed reflected, and an acknowledgement, which didn't have to be formal, could just be a conversation, that my grandfather had had the right to make the decision he made. The sale to the Dublin Development Company fell through. Todd's firm had a financing contingency that expired during the delay, and they walked away in July. My father and Diane relisted the property in August at $430,000. It sold in September to a couple from Columbus who wanted the land for a small agricultural operation. The closing happened on a weekday morning in September, with Margaret Hollis again conducting the transaction, and this time my name was on the seller's line where it was always supposed to be. My share of the proceeds, after the mortgage payoff and fees, was just over $190,000. I drove back to Columbus. I made coffee. I sat in my apartment with the windows open for a while, listening to the street noise, and felt the particular quiet of a thing that has been resolved. I deposited the check. I didn't tell anyone at work. I didn't post about it. I called Claire, and we had dinner at a restaurant on 4th Street, and she asked how things were going with my family, and I said they were better, which was mostly true. My father and I speak on the phone now once or twice a month. It's careful and it's real, and it's not what it was before Werner died, but it's something. Diane doesn't call me anymore. That's all right. Garrett sent me a text in October that said, I just want you to know I didn't think it was right, how things were handled. I read it twice and wrote back, Thank you. Because it mattered that he said it, and I didn't need it to be more than that. The property in Union County is someone else's now. The house my grandfather built and added onto and maintained for 50 years is being used for exactly the kind of slow, careful purpose he would have appreciated. I think about that sometimes. My grandfather used to say that a paper in the right drawer was worth 10 promises at the right table. He was right. But I think what he meant, underneath the practicality of it, was something simpler. The things that are genuinely yours don't need to be defended with anger or noise. They just need to be documented. They need to be there when someone looks. I was quiet for 3 years while pieces of my connection to that land were quietly removed, one at a time, by someone who was very organized and very patient and who believed, I think genuinely, that her version of the family story was the correct one. She wasn't wrong that I'd been absent. She wasn't wrong that my father had been the one paying the taxes and keeping up the insurance. But she was wrong about who the land belonged to, and she was wrong because she never pulled the abstract. She relied on what seemed obvious. My grandfather had relied on what was recorded. There's a lesson in that, I think, not about revenge, not about winning, but about the difference between what seems settled and what actually is. That's my story. A fireproof lockbox, a deed recorded in 2009, and a title officer who set down her pen. Have you ever had something taken from you quietly, not with a fight, but with small decisions, one at a time, until you looked up and it was gone? Or have you ever held on to something you knew was yours and waited for the right moment to let it speak for itself? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know how you handled it or how you wish you had. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.